Okay, I decided to tackle this problem head on because I think there is some resistance or misunderstanding in the Christian community of mind control, what it is, and whether or not that model should be used in dealing with the cult and spiritual abuse issue. I'm going to start out just by talking about, what is mind control, brainwashing, and thought reform. And I'm not going to talk about all these things in detail, but basically, Lifton was one of the first guys to understand what thought reform was, and it basically involves two things: confession, and then the re-education right here. Basically, you confess what was bad about your past and present, and then you are re-educated into making a new man. Another definition here is by Phil Zimbardo, and he says, I think mind control is a phenomenon encompassing all the ways in which personal, social, and institutional forces are exerted to induce compliance, conformity, belief, attitude, and value achieving others. You can see down here that Zimbardo is a former president of the American Psychological Association and a professor at Stanford University. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the government, because a lot of people that even written in Christian circles have talked about there is no such thing as mind control, or it's been thoroughly debunked by the scientific community. This is just a brief overview of the different classified thought reform projects that have been done by the CIA over the years. The asterisks mean that most of this is still classified. And even the stuff that's been released is heavily censored. And we have no way of really knowing what is still going on in the whole CIA mind control operations. More than likely, field operations are still being carried on by the government. So this is still pretty much of a shut case as far as we really know what the government has done and has not done. Dave?
Yeah, related to the question, the Freedom of Information Act, does it have much of an impact on that?
They will release information about some of these programs, but the issue is most of it is blacked out, so you can't make heads or tails out of really what they're trying to say. But some of this, you probably won't be able to get anything at all. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the Air Force experiments, Dr. West, Dr. Singer, and many, many others. But Dr. West, who I worked with for years, was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA. And at the time, during the whole brainwashing thing back in the 50s, West was so concerned about this problem that he designed this experiment to try to help Air Force officers become resistant to brainwashing. So he set up a group of people that pretended like they were shot down pilots over North Korea or South Korea, and then the other one group were like the interrogators, the communist interrogators. Well, to make a long story short, they had to stop the experiment because the people that were pretending like they were down pilots were confessing things to the fake North Korean interrogators that was classified. In other words, there's certain parts of the Air Force that they can't tell other members of the Air Force what you're talking about because it's classified. So pilots had certain codes and procedures, flight plans, certain kinds of codes they would use when they were flying. And some of the simulated interrogators were not pilots, so they were not privy to this information. So they stopped the experiment because the brainwashing was fairly effective on even in a fake situation. Dr. West, who passed away a few years ago, was a professor of psychology at Berkeley, and she used to work for the Army back during the times of the Korean War when brainwashing was a big deal, and she studied a lot of people, ex-soldiers that were Walter Reed, that had undergone brainwashing program. The Army has tons of stuff about their own studies and experiments, and she, to her dying day, could not get access to everything that the Army has done. Now, those are just a couple of cases that I'm familiar with, but there's been many, many others that have been involved in brainwashing stuff. One of my professors at the university was Carlton Schofield, and for years he was head of the United States Information Agency, which was basically responsible for psychological warfare. Even he could not get a hold of some of the information that was still classified. I remember one day he came into the class and he was so excited because this study that they did on Korean prisoners of war that had undergone brainwashing had just been released. And so he spent a couple of 3-hour class sessions talking about the differences between those that confessed and collaborated with the enemy and those that resisted. Now, if you're good Christians, those that resisted were Bible-believing, born-again Christians, right? And the ones that confessed were heathens and pagans. Guess what they really found out? There was no difference between those that collaborated with the enemy and those that resisted. They just couldn't figure out, what was the real variable that caused the difference. Now, I'm just going to skip down here. But anyway, Patrick Fitzgerald here, he's the guy that prosecutes Stu. He's a United States attorney, and he's did a lot of reports for the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks. And basically, he even uses the term brainwashing in this, and he says that the parents of the children of Al-Qaeda would be thankful to the bomber who killed the child. When legions of young men of fighting age are brainwashed into thinking that killing innocent children is noble, our security anywhere in the world is a grave risk. So the government is acknowledging the existence of brainwashing. Now, this is even more telling. Here it says that this is an unclassified substitute. The CIA's, this is just kind of a little summary of what the CIA has discovered about Al-Qaeda. And basically, they're saying that they were involved in classic brainwashing techniques. Now, this report came out a couple of years ago, and just to back up, I worked on the Moussaoui case for 2 years. Now, how many of you know who Zacharias Moussaoui was? Okay. And we got this into evidence. You can see this is one of the defense exhibits. We got that into evidence about the brainwashing of Moussaoui. And then also on this page, where does it talk about brainwashing again? I had this all memorized. Now I can't remember. Where is it? Anyway, there's 2 references to brainwashing in this document, and for some reason I don't see it here on the second page. I have no idea what happened to that. But anyway, that's just a bit of what the brainwashing stuff is going on in the government right now. I gave a talk at with at a CIA-sponsored talk at SAIC. It's like the private wing of the intelligence community. And after I gave my talk on how cults brainwash just like terrorists brainwash, and they recruit the same way, that was basically my testimony in the Moussaoui trial. And I gave a talk that was CIA-sponsored and talked about basically how to get people out of this mindset. And this person admitted that there's a deprogramming center in Yemen for terrorists. And maybe she shouldn't have told me that. But so we know that the government is on the trail, and they've probably been on the trail for a long time with this whole brainwashing thing. And we talk about legal cases.
When you're talking about government, are you talking about the U.S. government or the Yemen government? Okay.
U.S. government is, and they have bases in Yemen. And,
okay, so they have a base in Yemen that's a okay.
Right. Thank you. Now, these are a bunch of the cases that I testified in, and some people say that, brainwashing cannot be used in court, as a defense or whatever. There's about 29 cases here that I've either testified in or written reports or taken depositions in, and you can see this one was the Moussaoui case, and then another one you're probably fairly familiar with is that guy. That guy makes the DC sniper. And what was their whole defense? That this guy was brainwashed. And I think because of that, putting on that evidence, now these are the cases I've been involved in, not just cases on brainwashing. And I think we saved the guy from the electric chair or whatever they do to put people to death in the state of Virginia. But you can see there's close to 30 cases there. Now there's a couple in there where I just testified about what's a cult and so on and so forth. I think at least 26 of those cases directly have to do with brainwashing. So that gives you an example of just the cases I've been involved in. There's three cases of legal cases. So if someone says that the brainwashing has been thoroughly discredited by the scientific community, it's like what's news to me, and I keep going on and testifying again and again and again. And I think another important point here is that my testimony's never been rejected. And so now Alan Shefflin is out of University of Santa Clara, and I talked to him about a day or two before I came because he really keeps up on this stuff. He's written a couple of books. He wrote a classic book about the mind manipulators, and at that point in his life he was skeptical, but now he's become a true believer in brainwashing, and just testified in a case where he basically said that, yeah, you can produce a Manchurian candidate. Now, you're all familiar with the term Manchurian candidate, correct? Listen, that Lee Boyd Malvo, he was as programmed as you can be. If there's any case that is so clear in my mind as a person that was programmed to kill, it's Lee Boyd Malvo. And about 20 years ago, I worked on a case, and that's in my list there, Danny Kraft Jr. You remember the Lundgren murders in Ohio? How many remember that? Those people that helped Jeffrey Lundgren kill this entire family, they just did like the Stepford Wives. I mean, just completely without a conscience, murdered this entire family, threw them in a big pit in a barn, covered them with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of lime, and threw dirt over them. That was it. Horrible. Just horrible. Shefflin said this brainwashing issue is very much alive. He did a survey of all the legal cases. In the 50s, there was about 8 cases in the U.S. courts about brainwashing. And by the 2000, there was 231 cases. And he looked at how the term was used. Like sometimes lawyers use it rhetorically, like they'll say, well, this guy over here is just trying to brainwash the jury or something. But so about half of those really have to do with the process, the indoctrination process of brainwashing. So it is very active in the courts. The government is still involved in it. The government uses this to analyze terrorist organizations, so on and so forth. Now let's look at some of the literature. How many are familiar with occultic studies review? If you're not, how many of you here are seminary students? I have some advice for you. Petition the library to start subscribing to the occultic studies review. It's not one of those things where a subscription is several $100s a year. It's pretty reasonable, $30, $40. In fact, you guys could probably all take out the collection and go to the library and say, let's roll on this. The American Psychological Association, the Ohio Psychological Association, and the British Psychological Society. I have presented papers with APA, OPA, and in Wales, they have their annual meeting, the British Psychological Society, and I'm presenting on brainwashing. So in other words, it's really starting to become kind of a hot issue again, and I don't know if there's anything we can thank Al-Qaeda for, but that's one thing that's finally made us realize what is causing these people to do what they're doing. And so the brainwashing is really coming out as a respectable thing to look at and study. There's a book. I could have listed page after page of all this stuff. But there's a book published by Kathleen Taylor. She's a professor, I think, at Oxford. She's a neuropsychologist. And this is a very scholarly book that just came out a year or two ago, Oxford University Press. Now, let's talk a little bit about the research we've done at Wellspring. We looked at different forms of harm in former members. And this is a little bit about the conference that we did in Denver. And I worked with a bunch of collaborators on this. Roderick Marshall, he's actually the Dean of Faculty at the University of Glamorgan in Wales. Myself, Carmen Almendaros, who's a clinical psychologist at the University of Madrid. And Linda Dubrow-Marshall is a counseling psychologist married to Rod, and they're over in Wales now. And Jose Caraboles, or whatever, I never could pronounce his last name, but he's the chairman of the psych department at the University of Madrid. So we all collaborated on this study, and basically we looked at about 465 Wellspring clients and about 100 cult members from Spain. And we basically wanted to, I'm not going to explain all this to you, but you can look at it, is we have all kinds of measures that measure different kinds of harm, like depression, anxiety, dissociation, pencil and paper test takers. So if you have a question, raise your hand, because some of you aren't psychologists. And then we made a couple of scales based on what was in the literature of how people identify their group affiliation. And it's not important for you to know what these scales are, but basically, these paper and pencil tests, people fill out and describe how their group operated and what it was like, okay? So we did these things that measured the group, and then we measured all kinds of, whether you were abused as a child or, and all this stuff, and how much depression, how much anxiety you have. And we put this all together in these complicated, I'm even going to skip this. And here's these measures we used. really know all this, but you can tell that we really covered ourselves by measuring a whole bunch of different ways to look at distress, like post-traumatic stress and anxiety dissociation. And then what we tried to do is, I'm going to skip that too, is we saw first of all that the treatment of Wellspring works quite effectively. Like this is just a Beck depression inventory. On intake it was 20 and it dropped down to 10. You hardly ever see an F score that big. Any of you familiar with statistics? That's phenomenal. An F of 375. There's probably chances of less than 100,000. Even though we cut off the zeros, the chances of that happening just randomly are practically nil. And we did the same thing with dissociation on intake and 2 weeks later. So dissociation went down significantly too. Now, what's dissociation? Feeling like you're on drugs, you feel numb, you feel like you're half awake and half asleep, you can't respond emotionally. So a person that's dissociated may tell you, well, I don't feel anxious, I don't feel depressed, I don't feel anything. In fact, I don't know if I'm awake or I'm dreaming. And I felt that way for 2 years after I left my group. 2 years. I remember I'd sit on the back of the porch. Does that mean?
Wow.
My phone rings the same way. And I was highly dissociated. So that goes down after 2 weeks. I'm pushing the wrong button. So then we ran some real complicated statistics, and we found out that part of the questions that relate to how were you different than the rest of society seems to be related to the harm. In other words, the more the group seems to be different in any way, myself was different, the group was different, my identity was different, that seems to be what's causing the harm. And in other words, when you put that factor into the whole formula, the harm goes down. So the harm measure goes down. What do I mean by that? Is it rules out that the harm was caused by other factors other than the group. Because distress, sort of like Magnus, distress just was related to how that group operated. Okay. Are you with me so far? And that's powerful. No one has ever done research like this before because a lot of the apologists will say, well, these people were screwed up to begin with. And they would have showed these kind of symptoms anyway. Yeah.
What kind of apologists? Maybe explain what apologists you're speaking about.
Oh, the people that basically say that cults are no different than any other kind of group, and we shouldn't pick on these groups because you're stigmatizing people and you're prejudiced, and there's really, and if there's any harm that's come out of these groups, it's because maybe these people were harmed to begin with, or it's because they left the group and they weren't with their group anymore. So they were giving all kinds of excuses for why these groups don't hurt people. Thank you. So we ran a bunch of statistics with two measures. In other words, how important the group was to you has something to do with harm. So you can love a group, be excited about a group, but that doesn't predict harm. But how much the group kind of separates yourself from society and separates yourself from yourself. That's where the harm is. And then we basically did the same thing with the group psychological abuse scale. And then whatever this is, it has something to do with how you would identify with the group and how the group differentiates itself from the outside. That test too reinforce the fact that the harm is coming from some aspect of a group. Now, here's some other measures we did in 6 months. In other words, after they left and they'd gone home, we remeasured this, and I'm not going to define all these groups. I just want to, all these things were significant except antisocial. And thank goodness we don't make antisocial people. You know what an antisocial person is? It's not a people who doesn't like people. It's like the criminal types and everything. So anyway, let's look at this one, because this really relates to an awful lot of the avoidant personality has major trust issues. And in 6 months, that scale went from 65 to 21, which is phenomenal. The size effect is huge. I could go on and give the rest of the day for just this alone, but my point here is that trust is a major issue with former members. They don't trust you, and I think this is another reason, because they have to learn to trust the people that are entrusted to their care to help them get over it. And this is why, if you start hitting these people right away about, well, have you gone back to church or whatever, they're out the door. You have to reestablish the trust. And so, apparently what we're doing at Wellspring is working quite well in that area. Like I say, I could comment all day long about what that means.
What was the histrionic one? It seemed like it was higher.
How do you go back on the stupid thing?
There.
Backspace?
No, there it is, number 4.
You're there.
I'm there?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't see it move. Narcissistic or
No, the
histrionic?
histrionic.
Number 4.
That went up
Why was that?
because histrionic and narcissistic are related to self-esteem. Now, if the scale goes too high, then you're beginning to learn what's going on. But it went from 39 to 46. It means it elevated.
So that was a good thing.
That's a good thing, and I'm glad you brought that out. Narcissistic, that went up a little bit too, and that's a good thing. So in other words, these are measures of self-esteem as well as measures of personality. Now, accordingly, I wasn't going to get into this, but since you caught that, normally when they develop these tests, they do test, retest, validation. And even after treatment, you don't see these kind of changes in the personality scales. So what this really reinforces the idea that the cults and the spiritually abusive groups really mess with your personality. Because after treatment, the personality starts to completely change. See those scores? It's phenomenal. Yeah.
Have you ever tried to, do you think that corresponds to what we saw in Yankee and the Boston Church of Christ movement? Probably.
Yeah, he was using Myers-Briggs and found out that the personalities of people in the International Church of Christ, all congealed or gelled around a certain personality type. And then when you measure people in the normal churches, the personality types are all over the board. But when you're in a cult, personality types, form into little separate wives, right? That wasn't a
What's the
sex or state.
dependent? Does that mean you get more independent?
Exactly. More independent, more trusting, less dependent, because you see the dependent, see how that drops too? That's pretty big too. Okay, and that's just another way of looking at how, that's avoidant, depressive, dependent, how much those scores drop after treatment. And of course you see the big changes in anxiety and depression as well. I'm not going to talk about that
Do
otherwise.
people get better without help?
Boy, you got a group here. Well,
I want to know how screwed up I really am.
I had no help when I left. And I can honestly say that it was like scrounging around in the woods and finding little pieces that you could build a mosaic that finally made sense. And it took me 7.5 years to scrounge around in the woods, metaphorically speaking. But I did spend a lot of time in the woods after I left. And actually it was very therapeutic. I spent sometimes 4 or 5 hours in the woods a day when I left. But it took me 7.5 years, and I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to start Wellspring, because I thought, I don't want to put this on anyone, because I was lost. I mean, I was completely clueless as to what I wanted to do and what happened to me. And I already had a master's in psychology. It just shows you how great a psychologist I am. When I got out, I thought I had the flu or had allergies because I just didn't feel right, you know. I didn't have any energy, and I kept thinking, why can't I wake up, and why do things look like an impressionistic painting? And I mean, I was dazed. I didn't have the flu, I didn't have allergies. I had post-cult distress, like any that's been in a group like this had a lot of it. Now, this, I think, we're kind of switching gears and getting out of the data a little bit. This is the progress that they've noted, and I changed a little bit. For sort of psychologists, it's like the slippery slope that psychologists take before they screw up and commit an ethical violation. And this was one of my continuing education classes, and what I basically did, I kind of modified this. And I thought, this is exactly what happens to people that join cults. No one sets out to act unethically or join a bad group. And all of us, churches, psychologists, we're taught rules, doctrine, which affect ethical decisions. But they're sort of rule-bound. In other words, they're kind of rigid. They're not flexible. Now, most doctrinal mistakes combine ethical knowledge and developmental themes. Now, what do I mean by that? Developmental themes. You grow up. You move. You leave home. You go to school away from home. You break up with a boyfriend. You break up with a girlfriend. You get your first job. You have a baby. You suffered a severe illness. Those are all developmental themes that we all go through. It's at that point that people start to make mistakes. When they're going through some sort of crisis and transition. And so they're under pressure. And then opportunity happens. In other words, the friendly cult recruiter comes along and says, we can help you. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Your description of developmental themes could be called paradigm shifts or stages. And as a missionary, I'm always looking for those. Those paradigm shifts, because they're not mistakes, they're opportunities to,
That's right.
to speak into people's
Exactly.
lives.
So, in other words, these themes are normal. Everybody goes through them. But the wrong guy comes along and tries to solve the problem.
That's right.
And mistakes are usually due to feelings and not thinking. And I thought this is exactly how cult members. We all make mistakes because we have a need and somebody comes along and fills that need. And so personal needs can overwhelm an anxious and stressed out mind because of these developmental themes. And the implications here are tremendous, and I think I'll just take a couple of minutes and describe those. Is we need to become more self-aware as Christians when we're getting into trouble, when we're getting stressed. And we need to talk about it. Okay? That's our responsibility. And I think there's almost a shepherding responsibility too, that we don't do real well as islands. People need other people. The church is really a community. And I think that that caring for one another. And I've wrestled with this for many, many hundreds of years. I'm an old man. Why do people join cults? And basically, it's that care that we need, especially if people come out of Christian-based backgrounds. Something broke down. And there was a vulnerability, and there was no one there to help. And that's going to be it in a nutshell. Now, we also, all kinds of myths why people join. They're stupid. They come from dysfunctional families. They're weird. They have spiritual problems. They don't come from strong religious homes. I mean, I hear these myths all day and all night. So we decided to do some studies on why do people really join cults. There's hardly anything in the literature about really why people join cultic groups. So we took a look at this. We took a look at this at Wellspring, and what we do at Wellspring, we have a residential treatment center where people come and stay for 2 weeks, and we basically teach them an awful lot about how to recover from mind control. And we have an outside environment in the woods, and we really feel that helps. That's the lodge. That's where people come. It doesn't look like a hospital because it's not. We created it to make it look like a home, where people are treated like you're coming home. And it's in that environment that we think that, a lot of recovery starts to happen. And this is what it looks like. Now, the number's a little bit high. We looked at 523 people, and basically about 82% are white, and the average education for people to come to Wellspring is about 2 years of college, to summarize that. About 50% are single, 21% divorced or married, 13%. And you can see a preponderance of women come. And that's typical of all treatment literature. Women are just smarter to ask for help when they're hurting. That doesn't mean that men aren't as hurt. It's just women are more likely to seek help when they are hurting. Now, I think this is the important thing here, is that basically what you see here is what you see in the real world. People that came from born-again, conservative Christian homes, about 30% conservative. And Protestant liberal, about 20%, Catholic, 27%, and you just kind of see the playback. So the idea that somehow if you're raised in a conservative, Bible-believing atmosphere, this is some sort of inoculation from a cult. Not true.
I wonder, though, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think the statistics are a little skewed in the sense that you're doing a proportion of the general population. But if you did a proportion of the population, in other words, what percentage of Protestant fundamentalists, become members of cults, and what percentage of Jewish people become cults, I suspect, that there are some groups that have a higher percentage of people who become members of cults. In other words, you're just doing the general population.
Yeah.
How many come?
Yeah, we're just looking at, but that's a very good point. We're just looking at, how this kind of compares to the
To the general
non-cult
population.
membership.
Right. But
Yeah.
if you looked at, say, how many Jewish people there are in a city, and how many of them are members of a cult,
Right.
I think it would be a lot greater than, say, I'm just speaking of, than 2.7%.
It might be.
Yeah.
It very well might be. Yeah, I mean, we're just looking at different facts.
With the Protestant issue, too, many people go from group to group without really realizing what's going on, too.
That's true.
So we don't, that's the problem with getting accurate
Cold
numbers.
junkies.
Yeah,
Right.
cold hopping.
Yeah. Now, this is the types of groups that we deal with at Wellspring, and you can see that totalist groups are really totalist Christian groups that have Orthodox Evangelical statement of faith. So these are like the spiritually abused. That's the second highest. And then the first, second highest. The first highest are these pseudo-Christian groups. In other words, they're all Bible-based, but they really have usually one or two major, or 3 or 4 or 15 major doctrinal errors. But this group, these would pass the litmus test for, oh, you're one of us, you know. And yet they end up at Wellspring because they said, you know, this operated just like a cult. And Wendy and not terrible names. Doug gave a wonderful presentation this morning, and Raphael did. I'm going to blind you with my laser there.
I'll do
On
that.
spiritual abuse.
Okay, once you left
that
eye
can
left.
happen in very. Whoops. I'm gonna skip these. But anyway, we looked at this, and I better back up here. Hit backspace. Yeah, what drew you into the cult? And basically, this is what it was: social problems, about 15%; spiritual problems, 18%. They followed someone in. In other words, they were born in, or as a very young child, or something, and attracted a charismatic leader or a sense of family. And so you can see that people joined for some sort of affiliation, or they didn't have much choice and they just followed someone in. And here we have some really interesting quotes. I didn't see a good future for me. In other words, we took about 3 or 4 graduate students, and we did a classification analysis of this. And there was about an 85% agreement, so we know that people classified these pretty well. I had graduated from college, and I had a confused life. They seemed to be good people. I was in a rough spot, you know, all these developmental themes. I was depressed. I was vulnerable. I was looking to leave a bad home. So I mean, you can see all these people are in distress. And spiritual reasons. I'm a spiritual person. They seem to know what to do with me. My church was dead. You know what drew me in? I have all the little brownie points of a good little Christian boy. You know, I'm a preacher's kid. I went to Wheaton Academy. You ever heard of Wheaton Academy? Went to Taylor University, Christian College. And how could you get involved? Well, it's kind of like this. My church was dead. I was looking for a living church. This group came along, and they were winning more people with Campus Crusade and Navigators, and you know.
Who were you involved with?
A group called Great Commission. I truly felt that God was calling. I was feeling bad, and I wasn't going to church. I was convinced that I could be forgiven. It was a spiritual high. So those aren't necessarily doctrinal reasons. They're having something to do with more global spirituality. Or then, you know, I followed someone into the group. We were homeschooled, so they just pulled in because they were kids. I was drug in. My mom needed help. I was a young child. My sister joined first, then my dad, you know, so on. So you're drug in by loved ones or family members. For the charisma of the leader, he was a man of God. He was a dominant leader. I felt special. She was originally my patient in the hospital, and I was her personal nurse. She liked me. She had a dinner for all of us who took care of us. She was charming, and we would laugh and talk. She made me a new Christian. Oh, the wolf in sheep's clothing. I instantly fit in. There was no rejection. There was someone to talk to, someone always there. There was friendship. There was an exciting life. There was energy, friendliness. That's why people join. Now, the cult apologists, they debunk brainwashing, they misquote the literature, and they rewrite the history. I just have one thing to say about that. Basically, this article came out in the Cultic Studies Journal, and they really re-looked at what the apologists were saying about the American Psychological Association. And they put a spin that said, well, they really debunked brainwashing. And they concluded that a careful reading of the relevant documents indicates the APA has not rejected the notion of brainwashing. And like so many other theories in the behavioral sciences, the jury is still out on this one. What does this mean? It's just like hypnosis. Everybody believes in hypnosis, but there's about 5 theories about how it works. And that's kind of the way brainwashing is. It's not that people doubt it. It's like, what is the most likely theory that explains all of this? So you can have facts, but you know the overarching theory. Yeah. Oh, thanks. And the guys that did that, you know, some Italians do some good work at times. So how many do Italian background? And then psychiatry, they have a diagnosis called the dissociative disorder not otherwise specified. And it says states of dissociation that occur in an individual have been prolonged, or have been subject to periods of prolonged and intense coercive persuasion, brainwashing, thought reform, or indoctrination while captive. That is the typical, or the DSM is the legal classification for mental disorders. So the American Psychiatric Association definitely realizes it's a reality. And that's the Bible on diagnosis. There's no other legal or professional standard for diagnosis. Let's look at the biblical evidence. Lost sheep. You know, Jesus' first missionary journey was for the lost children of the house of Israel. And I really see the kind of the parallels today. I'm not saying this is exegetically accurate, but let's look at the people that have left our own flocks and see what happened to them. And just like it was back in that time, they were lost, they had no shepherd, they were mangled and thrown to the ground. In other words, the word in Greek is sometimes translated oppressed, but it almost really, well, the etymology of that word is like they've been plowed, like if they were laid down on the ground and a plow went over them, you know, and just kind of cut them up. Well, I think Jesus saw into their soul and basically saw that their soul and their spirit had been plowed, been mangled. So he had great compassion on these people. And then he said the harvest is plenteous, but the labor is few. There's tons of lost sheep out there. And then if you look at the anatomy of false prophets and false leaders, and I'm going to have to speed up here, and this is how they come on. Smooth, polished, successful. That's how they lure people. They try to meet needs. And what I did is I went back to the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, and found 210 verses that dealt with false prophets, priests, elders, and Pharisees, or bad Pharisees, or whatever. And I broke what these verses were saying down into 4 categories. What is the motive of these people? What are their behaviors? What is their fruit? And what is their doctrine? Surprisingly, all of the verses in the Bible speak mostly of the behavior of these people. Mm-hmm. And they speak least of all to their doctrine. And I thought, wow, what does this say about our theology? Mm-hmm. That our theology should be incarnational. What is God like over here? What is a false prophet like over here? And I thought, wow, if we maybe, I was just thinking that when I was looking at that, maybe if we look more at the characteristics of godliness, that would give us a clue so that we become more sensitive to the characteristics of ungodliness. Now, I consider myself a shepherd that's rarely with the flock. I am always out there in the wilderness finding lost sheep. That's my job. And in fact, even when I come to these conferences, I feel like I come out of the wilderness to regain society. You know, there was a book called The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. Listen, I'm not even on a road less traveled. I am off-road all the time and just come up to civilization once in a while because I've been running around tending lost sheep. And I thought, these wolves, they can have any kind of disguise they want. Christian disguise, New Age, psychologist, they'll put on any kind of, the sheep and the wolf in sheep's clothing. Sheep's clothing come in many, many guises. I can look at a wounded sheep, and I can see the scars, and I can see the footprints all around that wounded sheep, and I can always say, that's a wolf. I can never tell you what kind of skin it had on, because that changes all over the place. But those bite marks, those claw marks, those footprints, if you forget everything else that I'm saying, they are the same time and time and time again, because the wolf has a certain way of killing people. And you can always see those marks on a wounded sheep. If you look at the doctrine, there's thousands of different doctrinal variations all over the place. But, if you start to study what the Bible really says about how these people operate, I think it's a more effective paradigm for dealing with this whole cult and spiritual abuse issue. Then, by that, it doesn't separate out those that believe the fundamentals of the faith versus those that are heretics, because it looks at the commonality of all of it, and that's the fruit. Jesus says, beware of false prophets and false Christs. You shall know them by their fruit. And that really goes back to what it's really saying. The fruit, that's the emphasis in the Bible. It's not that doctrine is not important, because it's very important. I went back and I just looked at the verses then about false prophets, teachers in Christ, took out the Pharisees and the elders, and you pretty much get the same thing. The total verses 144, behavior 44%, doctrine 12.5%. Again, the largest percent is behavior, the smallest percent is doctrine. You go through the Bible and you see all kinds of marks of the false prophet. But anyway, the emphasis is they're deceivers, liars, enticers, crafty, flattering, and persuasive. In other words, they're appealing to felt need. And then the second most popular thing is that they're engaged in false prophecy, false hopes, false visions. But basically, this has to do with how they present themselves as recruiters. And the results, this is like the list of psychological damage. But this is from the Bible. The person that's a victim of these false people, they're confused, they don't have good healing, they start to trust in lies, they're scattered, they're sick, they're wounded, they become vulnerable, they feel alone. That's like a symptom checklist for a modern psychologist's office. That's the Bible. The summary is that people that have been involved with a false teacher suffer psychological and spiritual harm. Conclusion. I think brainwashing exists. The concept is, I think, embedded in Scripture when we look at all the behavioral clues that's throughout Scripture. They try to break you down, tell you that who you are isn't okay, and then they try to rebuild you into the image of what they want out of you. False prophets are all fairly similar. Oh, I skipped. Doctrine is not the key. It is secondary. It's like looking at things through a funnel the wrong way. Doctrine is part of the program, but it's not the key. In fact, when I worked on the Moussaoui trial, I talked to Dr. Al-Masari. Did you ever see his special on PBS about terrorists? He himself is very sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. There was a warrant out for his arrest in Saudi Arabia. He's a Saudi. And he, like most scoundrels, are hiding in London. And I had about a 4-hour interview with him about how Al-Qaeda recruits. He has a website out, and he shows all the beheadings and everything. Thinks it's wonderful with the infidels who lose their heads. So anything, he clearly told me that when people get affiliated with Al-Qaeda, the first thing we do is friendship. We take care of them. We treat them like family. The teaching comes later. And I think of Zacharias Moussaoui, when he left France and he went to England, he was lonely, he was a Frenchman, he was also ethnically North African, And he didn't know anybody. He was lonely, he didn't have any money. And I thought, where were the Christians? There is a typical example of felt need. This guy was in a new culture, learning a new language, away from home, and, he was sort of an outcast anyway. He was never accepted in France because he was, from Moroccan ancestry. And I thought, where was the church? But you know who took him in? Al-Qaeda. They gave him a home. Made him feel accepted, probably for the first time in his life. And and you could repeat that story over again and again and again. People join for felt needs. They don't join for doctrinal reasons. People recover spiritually and psychologically by meeting needs, processing the experience by a thought reform model, and true biblical shepherding. I could have expanded on so much of this stuff, but I only have an hour. And I got a few minutes here to take questions. Before I take the question, remember the plenary session is over at the chapel at 3 o'clock. But anyway, questions?
What have you found with medical or physical problems with people who come out? Is there a correlation between a greater level, a higher level of brainwashing and physical problems, and what typically are some problems that people have?
In case you didn't see her question, she sees a lot of people with physical problems that come out, and is this related to a higher level of brainwashing? That's one possibility, and I don't disagree with it. The other one is just the length of time they've been in the group. I remember I had a fellow that came to Wellspring. He called himself Carlos, but he was German. He was 2 weeks away from getting his residency in psychiatry from a wonderful German university. But by that time, he was already in a cult, and they thought, he's too weird. We can't give him his residency certificate to practice psychiatry. He came to me in his mid-50s, and he was a broken man. I mean, emotionally, physically, spiritually. You know what he did for work? This guy was already a medical doctor. He was repairing old ladies' back porch screens and, raking leaves and whatever. And his broken health was due to, I think, the meager diet, the lack of just living a normal life. It was a tragedy.